Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do it here,
Right.
taking one super complex topic and breaking it down so we can all actually understand what's going on. So today, we're tackling the Afghan economy under the Taliban rule,
Oh, yeah.
using an in-depth analysis by Akhilesh Goivedi called Analysis of Afghanistan's Economic Situation under the Taliban.
Right.
Pretty straightforward title. And look, I know Afghanistan's economy, it's not exactly light dinner conversation,
Yeah.
but stick with us
Mhm.
because honestly, this stuff matters, and
Yeah.
we're going to make it interesting, I promise. We'll unpack the immediate challenges this country is facing, what it all means for everyday Afghans, and of course, the ripple effects across the globe.
It's really important to understand that even before the Taliban came into power, Afghanistan was already facing a whole host of economic problems.
Right.
We're talking poverty, government mismanagement, corruption.
Not exactly a recipe for success.
No, not at all. And then you add in this persistent drought that they've been dealing with for years.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. So it was already kind of a fragile situation even before the Taliban?
Exactly. And to give you an idea of just how fragile, in 2020, the World Bank ranked Afghanistan 173rd out of 190 countries in their Doing Business survey.
So not exactly a great place to start a business.
No, not at all. So when the Taliban took over in August of 2021, it was like a huge shock to an already vulnerable system.
Yeah.
And, one of the immediate consequences was this mass exodus of skilled workers and experts. They were fleeing the country.
Yeah, I remember seeing those images on the news. It was just heartbreaking. And I imagine that loss of expertise must have really crippled the government institutions.
It absolutely did. It was like pulling the rug out from under them.
Yeah.
And it contributed to some of the other big problems that emerged, like the frozen assets.
Right, because the U.S. froze something like $9.5 billion belonging to Afghanistan's central bank.
Yeah.
And then there was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Mhm.
They suspended Afghanistan's access to something called special drawing rights. Now, I've heard that term thrown around. But to be honest, I'm not totally clear on what it actually means.
So special drawing rights are basically a kind of international reserve asset that countries can use to supplement their existing reserves. It's sort of like a global piggy bank.
Okay, so kind of like emergency funds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan desperately needed those funds, but because of the Taliban takeover, they couldn't access them. And then on top of that, major donors like Germany, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, they all hit pause on their aid programs.
So it was like a double whammy, internal problems plus this sudden loss of outside support.
Right. And that's had a devastating impact on the lives of everyday Afghans. We're talking about a country where over 47% of the population was already living below the poverty line before the Taliban took over.
It's hard to even imagine.
And about a third of employed Afghans were surviving on just 1.9 a day. Think about trying to feed a family on that.
It's just unimaginable. And with the foreign aid cut off, it must be even harder now.
Absolutely, because that aid was crucial for funding essential services like education and healthcare. Without it, those services are really at risk of collapsing. And the analysis even warns about the potential for hyperinflation.
Okay, hyperinflation. Break that down for us.
So basically it means prices could skyrocket, making it almost impossible for people to afford even the most basic necessities.
So we're talking about a potential economic disaster on top of a humanitarian crisis.
Right. And, Afghanistan has also been dealing with a really severe drought, which is only making things worse.
Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten about that. It's been going on for years, hasn't it?
It has. So food shortages were already a concern, and this economic turmoil could easily push the country toward a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
So all of this sounds incredibly dire. What about the private sector? Is there any hope there?
Well, unfortunately, the private sector in Afghanistan is pretty much paralyzed. It's been hampered by years of insecurity, corruption, political instability.
So there's not a lot of opportunity for businesses to grow and create jobs.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
really a challenging situation, and it's going to take a lot of effort to turn things around.
Yeah, and a lot of that is going to depend on the Taliban and the policies they choose to implement.
Absolutely. Their decisions are going to have a huge impact on the economic future of Afghanistan.
Okay, so speaking of the bigger picture,
Yeah.
what about the impact on the surrounding region? Because I imagine the U.S. withdrawal created a bit of a power vacuum, right?
You got it. It's like
Yeah.
this geopolitical chess match is happening now. You've got all these regional players maneuvering for influence. And China, for example, is looking to capitalize on the situation and extend its Belt and Road initiative.
Which is their massive infrastructure project across Asia.
Exactly. They're seeing an opportunity to gain more influence in the region.
And what about India? Weren't they pretty heavily invested in Afghanistan before the Taliban took over?
They were. And they're trying to figure out how to maintain a foothold even though they don't actually share a direct border with Afghanistan.
Right. They've got Pakistan in the way.
Exactly. And that makes things really complicated because India and Pakistan have a very tense relationship. And, you have to wonder if Pakistan sees this as a bit of a win with the Taliban now in control.
Yeah. It's a really complex situation. The relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban has always been kind of a roller coaster. Pakistan played a role in the Taliban's formation back in the 90s, but it's not always been smooth sailing.
And then you've got Russia kind of lurking in the background.
Oh, yeah. Russia's definitely watching all of this very closely. They have their own interests in the region.
So it's a very fluid situation with lots of different players vying for power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Okay. So while the world is sort of waiting to see what the Taliban does, what about the businesses that were already operating in Afghanistan? What's the situation like for them?
It's pretty chaotic. I mean, imagine trying to run a business when trade and supply chains are disrupted. Transportation is unreliable. It's almost impossible to import or export goods.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare. It is. And then on top of that, you've got the added layer of uncertainty and fear because of the Taliban.
Are businesses at risk?
There's a lot of fear about that. Some local businesses worry about being looted by Taliban fighters, and the lack of clear policies from the Taliban is just making things worse. Nobody knows what to expect.
Yeah, that unpredictability would be really tough to deal with as a business owner.
And then you have these major infrastructure projects that were in the works, like the Taiyari gas pipeline.
Right, the one that was supposed to bring natural gas from Turkmenistan to India through Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Exactly. That project is now on hold, and it's unclear if or when it will be revived. And then there was another big project, CASA 1000.
Remind me what that was.
CASA 1000 was designed to bring electricity from Central Asia to South Asia. It was meant to connect those regions and boost economic development.
So another potentially game-changing project.
Right. But with the Taliban in charge, its future is very uncertain. And it's a shame because these projects had the potential to bring much-needed stability and economic growth to the entire region.
It's like taking 2 steps forward and then getting pushed 10 steps back.
Yeah, it's really frustrating.
So it sounds like the outlook for the Afghan economy is pretty bleak right now. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, it's true that the challenges are immense, but there could be a glimmer of hope. The analysis suggests that new relationships with countries like Russia and China could lead to some investment, especially in developing Afghanistan's natural resources.
So Afghanistan could become a resource hub.
It's possible. They have a lot of untapped potential. But it would all depend on the Taliban creating a stable and trustworthy environment.
Right, because investors need to have confidence. They need to know that their money is safe.
Yeah.
And that they can operate without fear of corruption or instability.
Exactly. If the Taliban want to attract foreign investment, they need to address those issues. They need to show the world that they're serious about creating a predictable and reliable business environment.
So it seems like the ball is really in the Taliban's court. They have some huge decisions to make. And the path they choose will determine the economic future of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. That's the crux of the issue. And that's what we'll be exploring in more depth as we continue this deep dive.
All right, so buckle up, folks, because things are about to get even more interesting.
One of the things that this analysis really highlights is the huge importance of recognition for the Taliban government.
Recognition from who?
Well, from both international organizations and other countries.
Okay, and why is that recognition so important?
Well, basically without it, they're completely shut out of the global financial system.
Meaning no access to loans?
Exactly. No development assistance. Even basic trade becomes incredibly difficult. It's like trying to rebuild a shattered economy with your hands tied behind your back.
So it's kind of a catch-22, right? The Taliban needs to show that it can govern responsibly to gain that recognition. But it's a really tough ask when they're struggling just to keep the basic functions of government running.
It is a real tightrope walk. And one thing that I found really interesting in the analysis was this discussion about Afghan entrepreneurs.
Oh, wow. So even in the midst of all this chaos, there are people trying to start and run businesses.
Yeah, there are. And I think it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. This desire to create something, to build a better future for themselves and their families, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Yeah, that takes a lot of courage.
It really does. And, the success or failure of these entrepreneurs could be a major indicator of whether Afghanistan can actually turn things around.
It's like a microcosm of the larger economic situation.
Exactly. It puts a very human face on this whole complex issue.
So we've got this intricate web of internal challenges, external pressures, and then you've got the hopes and dreams of everyday Afghans all mixed in there. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from all of this?
Well, for me, it all comes down to the choices that the Taliban makes. They really hold the keys to Afghanistan's economic future. Will they embrace policies that promote stability, growth, inclusivity, or will they cling to their old ways and risk further isolation and hardship?
So essentially the ball is in their court. Okay, so let's play this out for a second. The Taliban has said that they want to be more moderate this time around. What would that actually look like in terms of specific economic policies?
That is the million-dollar question. What concrete steps could they take to demonstrate real change and convince the international community to re-engage?
Well, for starters, they could address the concerns about women's rights. Allowing women to work and contribute to the economy, that would set a really powerful signal.
Absolutely. And think about the potential talent pool they'd be tapping into. It's not just about rights, it's about economic pragmatism.
And what about tackling corruption? That's been a huge problem in Afghanistan for years.
You're right. Corruption acts like a tax on everything. It makes it more expensive and risky to do business. So if the Taliban is serious about economic reform, they need to create a transparent and accountable system that encourages investment, both from inside and outside Afghanistan.
Right, because they need to reassure those foreign investors that their assets will be safe, especially after what happened with the frozen funds.
Exactly. They need to build trust. And maybe they could offer some guarantees, create special economic zones with favorable regulations. They could even seek guidance from organizations like the World Bank on how to create a more attractive investment climate.
So it sounds like they've got a lot of work to do, but it's not impossible.
No, it's not. They have a chance to write a new chapter for Afghanistan, but it's up to them to make the right choices.
What about the role of the international community? What should they be doing?
That's the other side of the equation. Complete isolation of Afghanistan would be disastrous for the Afghan people. And it could backfire. It could push the Taliban further into the arms of countries that might not have Afghanistan's best interests at heart.
So a more nuanced approach is needed.
I think so. Something that balances the need to hold the Taliban accountable with the need to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
So maybe a phased approach, where aid and investment are tied to concrete progress on things like human rights, women's rights, tackling corruption.
Exactly. It's a high-stakes game,
Yeah.
but one that has to be played very carefully.
This all makes me think about something we haven't really touched on yet, the opium trade. Afghanistan is a major producer of opium, and it's been a source of revenue for the Taliban in the past. How does that factor into the equation?
That's a great question, and one that adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. The opium trade has been both a blessing and a curse for Afghanistan. It provides income for some farmers, but it's also fueled corruption and instability.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It really is. And it's definitely something the Taliban will have to grapple with as they try to chart a new economic course for the country.
So there are a lot of factors at play here, and it seems like there's no easy solution.
Definitely not.
What are some of the potential scenarios that could play out in Afghanistan?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Let's start with the best-case scenario. Imagine the Taliban really surprises everyone. They implement genuine reforms, they tackle corruption head-on, they guarantee rights, and they actually create a stable environment where businesses can thrive. Foreign aid starts flowing back in. Investments pour into the country. Maybe even those big infrastructure projects like TPI and CASA 1000 get back on track.
So Afghanistan becomes a hub for regional trade and development. That's quite a turnaround.
It would be huge. But it's not entirely impossible. Afghanistan sits at a strategic crossroads in Asia. It has the potential to connect markets and resources if they play their cards, right?
Okay. But let's be realistic. What's a more likely scenario? What happens if the Taliban takes some steps in the right direction, but maybe not enough to totally convince the international community?
That's probably a more realistic outcome,
Yeah.
Maybe they make some concessions on things like women's education or basic human rights, but they don't go far enough on issues like political freedom or inclusive governance.
It's got a half measure.
Yeah, and in that case, you'd probably see a trickle of aid and investment, but not the kind of flood that would be needed to really transform the economy.
So a slow and bumpy road.
Exactly. Maybe some pockets of progress here and there, but still a lot of hardship and uncertainty for most Afghans.
And of course, there's always the risk that things could go in the opposite direction.
Right.
The worst case scenario, what does that look like?
The Taliban could revert to their old ways. Crackdowns on dissent, human rights abuses, a return to isolationism.
And that would be
a disaster for Afghanistan and a major setback for the entire region.
Think about the refugee crisis that would spark the potential for further instability. even the possibility of terrorist groups regaining a foothold.
Yeah, it's not a good picture.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder of just how high the stakes are in this situation.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the human cost. Millions of Afghans are caught in the middle of all of this. Their lives, their hopes, their dreams are hanging in the balance.
It's easy to get lost in the economic data and the geopolitical maneuvering, but at the end of the day, there are real people trying to survive and build a future for themselves.
Right.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the situation in Afghanistan now. What's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that the future of Afghanistan is not set in stone. It's being shaped right now by the choices being made by the Taliban, by the international community, and by the Afghan people themselves. It's a complex and evolving situation, and one that we all need to keep paying attention to.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written and one that we all have a stake in. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on another deep dive. We'll see you next time.